London, 1471. A crowd of nearly 300 people packed into the Tower courtyard, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the freezing March rain. They came to witness justice. What they saw instead would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Thomas Howard, Earl of Essex, stood among the nobility section, wearing his finest velvet doublet. His face held an expression that didn't belong there. As the executioner's assistant tightened the ropes on the rack, stretching his son's body until joints began to separate with wet popping sounds, the Earl's lips curved upward. He was smiling. The young man on the rack was William Howard, age 19, accused of conspiring against King Edward IV during the Wars of the Roses. The evidence was thin. 3 letters, possibly forged. A servant's testimony obtained under questionable circumstances. Nothing solid. But in 1471 England, solid evidence wasn't required when the king wanted someone made into an example. William screamed as the rack turned another notch. His shoulders dislocated with sounds like green wood snapping. His father's smile didn't waver. Several nobles standing near the Earl shifted uncomfortably. Lady Margaret Beaufort, standing 3 feet away, would later write in her private diary that she saw Thomas Howard's hands trembling violently, even as his face remained composed in that grotesque expression of pleasure. Here's what the crowd didn't understand. Under medieval English law, showing sympathy for an accused traitor was itself an act of treason. Weeping for your tortured son could be interpreted as agreement with his alleged crimes. Even a neutral expression might be read as suppressed loyalty to the accused. The Earl of Essex wasn't smiling because he enjoyed watching his eldest son torn apart. He was smiling because not smiling would have meant joining William on that rack. The torture continued for 2 hours. William's interrogators wanted names. Who else was involved in this supposed conspiracy? Every time William screamed his father's name, begging for intervention, the Earl's smile broadened slightly. Court observers noted this in their reports to the king. See how Lord Essex demonstrates his loyalty? Even his own blood means nothing compared to service to the crown. But wait, it gets worse. Because this wasn't just about one man's survival instincts. This was about a systematic mechanism of control that turned families into weapons against themselves. The Earl of Essex owned 12,000 acres of prime English farmland. He had 4 other children. His wife was pregnant with their 6th. Everything he possessed, everyone he loved, hung on how he reacted in that courtyard. 3 rows behind him stood Sir Geoffrey Mallory, the king's chief investigator. Mallory's job was simple. Watch Thomas Howard. Note every facial tic, every moment of weakness, every sign that the Earl might share his son's treasonous sympathies. Mallory had 17 men executed the previous year based solely on how they'd reacted while watching relatives tortured. He was very good at his job. By the time they removed William from the rack, his arms hung at impossible angles. His legs no longer functioned. Blood ran from his mouth where he'd bitten through his tongue. They dragged him to a cell to await trial, which everyone knew was just theater. The verdict was already decided. As the crowd dispersed, several people approached the Earl of Essex to congratulate him on his composure and loyalty. He accepted their praise with the same fixed smile. His hands never stopped shaking. The grotesque political theater was just beginning. What came next would prove that medieval justice didn't just destroy bodies. It obliterated entire family lines, one calculated betrayal at a time. The charges against William Howard read like fiction, even by medieval standards. He'd allegedly conspired with Lancastrian sympathizers to poison the king's wine supply, assassinate 3 royal advisors, and incite a peasant rebellion in Yorkshire. The evidence consisted of those 3 letters and testimony from a single servant who'd been tortured for 6 days before suddenly remembering crucial details. William Howard's actual crime was simpler and more mundane. He'd gambled away significant money to the wrong people. Those people happened to be connected to nobles who wanted the Howard family estates. Framing William for treason was more efficient than challenging the family's land claims through legitimate legal channels. Thomas Howard understood this perfectly. He'd played these games himself often enough. 3 years earlier, He'd helped orchestrate similar charges against Baron Wycombe to acquire coastal properties. Medieval politics wasn't warfare. It was systematic cannibalism dressed in legal procedure. The morning after the courtyard torture, a royal messenger arrived at Howard's London residence. The Earl was summoned to give testimony before the Privy Council. His presence was required at his son's formal questioning. Translation: he would publicly denounce William or face charges himself. The session took place in a windowless chamber beneath Westminster Palace. William was brought in on a stretcher, his dislocated limbs bound in crude splints. They'd set his bones just enough to keep him alive for trial. The pain of those badly reset joints was worse than the original torture. 5 council members sat in judgment. Thomas Howard stood to the side, positioned so William could see him clearly. The lead inquisitor, Bishop Edmund Croft, began reading the charges. After each accusation, he turned to the Earl. Lord Essex, did your son express anti-royal sentiments in your presence? Thomas Howard's throat constricted. His son's eyes pleaded with him. Every instinct screamed to protect the boy he'd taught to ride horses, to fight with swords, to read Latin. The boy who'd fallen from a tree at age 7 and broken his arm, crying in Thomas's lap until the surgeon arrived. Yes, Your Grace, on multiple occasions. The words came out steady, practiced. William's face crumpled, not from physical pain, from something deeper. Did he meet with known Lancastrian sympathizers? Thomas Howard knew the truth. William had met with cloth merchants from York who happened to have distant Lancastrian connections, business meetings, nothing more. Yes, Your Grace. I witnessed such meetings myself and should have reported them. I failed in my duty to the Crown. By implicating himself in minor oversight, Thomas protected himself from charges of active conspiracy. It was a calculated move. Admit small failures to avoid large accusations. The inquisitors produced instruments, a brazier of coals, iron pincers, thumbscrews. They explained these would be used if William failed to provide satisfactory answers. They heated the pincers until they glowed orange. Lord Essex, you will remain present throughout this questioning. Your observations will be recorded for the King's review. For the next 4 hours, Thomas Howard watched his son tortured in ways that made the rack seem merciful. They burned the soles of his feet, crushed his fingers one by one, used blades to remove small strips of skin from his back. Between each application of pain, they asked questions. William's answers were incoherent, confused, desperate attempts to tell them what they wanted to hear. Thomas Howard maintained his composed expression. Several times his stomach rebelled, but he swallowed the bile. Once, when William screamed particularly loudly, the Earl actually forced a small laugh. Bishop Croft noted this approvingly in his records. The only crack came when they brought out the strappado. They tied William's hands behind his back, attached a rope, and hoisted him up by his bound wrists until his full body weight hung from his dislocated shoulders. The pain was indescribable. William's screams turned into sounds that didn't seem human anymore. Thomas Howard's left eyelid developed a violent twitch. He couldn't control it. For 15 seconds, his carefully maintained mask slipped, his face contorted in anguish. Sir Geoffrey Mallory saw it, made a note in his ledger. When they finally lowered William, he was unconscious. They revived him with cold water. The questioning continued. At one point, William turned his head toward his father and spoke through broken teeth. Please, just tell them the truth. You know I'm innocent. The room went silent. Every official present watched Thomas Howard's reaction. The Earl looked directly at his son. You are guilty of treason. I testified to that fact. Accept your punishment like a man instead of begging like a coward. William's remaining spirit broke visibly. Something died in his eyes that had nothing to do with physical damage. The physical torture was horrific, but the psychological destruction of watching your own father choose political survival over your life was a different kind of death entirely. And as the session ended and William was dragged back to his cell, Thomas Howard walked to his carriage with the same fixed smile he'd worn in the courtyard. but his hands shook so badly that his servants had to help him inside. That night, alone in his private chambers, the Earl of Essex vomited until his stomach was empty, then continued dry heaving until his throat bled. But by morning, he would compose his face again. Because in medieval England, love itself was a liability that could destroy everything you'd built, and Thomas Howard had built his life on understanding that brutal truth better than most. Medieval England operated on a legal principle called corruption of blood. When someone was convicted of treason, the taint didn't stop with them. It infected their entire bloodline. Children lost inheritance rights. Wives became legal non-persons. Siblings found themselves suddenly unemployable. Extended family members discovered their business partnerships dissolved overnight. This wasn't accidental cruelty. It was engineered social control. By making treason a family disease rather than an individual crime, the Crown ensured that families policed themselves more effectively than any royal guard could. Parents informed on children. Siblings betrayed each other. Spouses provided testimony that guaranteed death sentences. The alternative was collective destruction. Thomas Howard understood this system intimately because he'd used it himself. In 1468, he'd reported his own brother-in-law for speaking favorably about the deposed Lancastrian king. The brother-in-law was hanged. His estate was divided between the Crown and Thomas Howard. Howard's wife never spoke to him again with any warmth, but she kept speaking to him. Because what choice did she have? Now, that same mechanism was pointed at his family. If William was formally convicted of treason, the corruption of blood would extend to all of Thomas's children. His 4 other sons would lose their inheritance rights. His daughter's marriage prospects would evaporate. The pregnant wife would give birth to a legally tainted child. Everything Thomas had accumulated over 30 years of careful political maneuvering would vanish, unless he could prove his own loyalty was stronger than blood ties. The day after the Privy Council torture session, Thomas Howard did something that shocked even hardened medieval observers. He petitioned the king for permission to personally participate in his son's interrogation. He wanted to question William himself, under torture. King Edward IV granted the request. It was perfect political theater. What better demonstration of loyalty than a father willing to torture his own son to extract treasonous confessions? The session was scheduled for 3 days later. But during those 3 days, something else was happening in parallel. Something the public never saw. Thomas Howard was spending every waking hour trying to save William through different channels. He sent secret messages to nobles who owed him favors, begging them to intervene with the king. He offered bribes to court officials who might be able to make evidence disappear. He contacted the families orchestrating the false charges and offered to surrender specific properties in exchange for dropping the accusations. Every attempt failed. The nobles who owed him favors suddenly had convenient memory failures. Officials who'd accepted his money for years now refused to even meet with him. The families behind the charges wanted complete destruction, not negotiated settlements. They'd invested too much in this operation to accept partial victory. Thomas Howard was discovering what many medieval fathers learned too late. Once the machinery of state persecution began grinding, personal connections meant nothing. Money meant nothing. Past loyalty meant nothing. The system consumed everything in its path, and trying to interfere only made you the next target. On the morning of the scheduled interrogation, Thomas Howard arrived at the tower 2 hours early. He stood alone in the torture chamber, staring at the instruments he would be expected to use on his own son. The rack, the strappado, the pair of anguish, the knee splitter. Each device had been cleaned and maintained by the tower's professional torturers. They gleamed in the torchlight like surgical instruments. A guard brought William in. The young man could no longer walk. His previous torture sessions had destroyed too much of his body. They'd kept him alive with rough medical care because corpses couldn't confess to anything. When William saw his father standing in the torture chamber, he actually laughed. A broken, bitter sound that came from somewhere deeper than physical pain. "So it's you then. Of course it's you." Thomas Howard's carefully maintained composure cracked for the first time in public. His face twisted into something between anguish and rage. For 5 full seconds, he couldn't speak. The guards present would later testify to this moment, but by then it wouldn't matter. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Court records show that Thomas Howard personally applied torture to his son on 14 separate occasions during that period. He used the thumbscrews. He operated the rack. He held hot irons close enough to William's skin to produce blistering without permanent marking, a technique designed to maximize pain while preserving the body for public execution. Between each application of torture, Thomas asked questions. The questions came from a script provided by the Privy Council. He had no freedom to improvise or soften them. Every word was predetermined. Name your fellow conspirators. Describe your planned assassination attempt. Identify which foreign powers you contacted. William's answers became increasingly incoherent as the torture progressed. He started naming people randomly. Some were dead. Some were figments of imagination. Some were actual nobles who'd never met William, but who had enemies on the Privy Council. Every name William provided would trigger new investigations, new arrests, new torture sessions. The medieval justice system was a perpetual motion machine of manufactured guilt. Each confession created more suspects. Each suspect's torture produced more confessions. The wheel turned endlessly, crushing lives in its mechanism. Halfway through the session, William stopped screaming. His vocal cords had been damaged too severely to produce sound anymore. He could only make wet, gasping noises. Thomas Howard continued following the script, applying torture, asking questions, recording answers that made no sense. At one point, William managed to form words again. He looked directly at his father and spoke clearly for the first time in hours. "I know what you're doing. I understand why. I forgive you." Thomas Howard's hands froze on the rack's wheel. Every person in that chamber heard those words. Sir Geoffrey Mallory, present as always, wrote them down verbatim. The Earl's face went through a series of expressions too fast to track. Grief, rage, relief, despair, hate. Then the mask returned. Thomas Howard's face settled back into neutral composure. "Your forgiveness is irrelevant. You are a traitor. Confess your crimes completely, or the torture continues." William smiled. Despite his ruined body, despite the pain that should have made consciousness impossible, he smiled. Not the forced political smile his father wore. A genuine expression of something that might have been peace. Then continue. As the torture intensified, court officials began to suspect that the father's composure hid something far more sinister than political calculation. Because a father who could maintain that level of control while destroying his own son's body wasn't demonstrating loyalty. He was demonstrating something broken in his fundamental humanity. And in medieval England, that kind of brokenness was exactly what the system required to function. After 6 hours of torture administered by his own father, William Howard's body had been transformed into something barely recognizable as human. His fingers were crushed into useless pulps. Burns covered 70% of his exposed skin. His shoulders had been dislocated and relocated so many times that the joints no longer functioned properly. When guards carried him back to his cell, pieces of him left trails on the stone floor. But he was still alive. Medieval torturers were skilled at their craft. They knew exactly how much damage a body could absorb while maintaining consciousness and the ability to speak. Death was easy. Keeping someone alive and aware while systematically destroying them required expertise. The trial was scheduled for 5 days after that final torture session. 5 days to let William heal just enough to appear in court without immediately dying. 5 days for the Howard family to fully understand what was coming. Thomas Howard spent those 5 days in a state that his servants would later describe as living death. He ate nothing, drank only water when forced, sat in his study staring at nothing for hours. His wife tried to speak with him once. He threw a candlestick at her head, not in anger, in something worse than anger, in mechanical violence that required no emotion at all. His other children were kept away from him. They'd already been told that their brother was a traitor, that their father was a hero for exposing him. that the family would be fine as long as everyone maintained proper loyalty to the crown. They were being trained in the same mechanisms that were destroying their father. On the third night, Thomas Howard's closest friend, Sir Robert Ashford, managed to get past the servants and confront him in his study. Ashford had known Thomas since childhood. They'd fought together in France, saved each other's lives multiple times. "You could have saved him," Ashford said. "You're wealthy enough, connected enough. You could have found a way." Thomas Howard looked at his oldest friend with eyes that held nothing human anymore. "No, I couldn't. Neither could you. Neither could anyone. That's the entire point." "Then why smile? Why pretend satisfaction?" "Because pretending is all we have left. The moment I show what I really feel, I join him. Then my other sons join us. Then my daughters. Then my wife and unborn child. The system doesn't stop consuming until there's nothing left to consume. So I smile. I torture my own son. I testify against him. And I wake up the next day and do it again. That's how we survive." Ashford left without another word. He would later tell his own family that Thomas Howard had already died in that torture chamber. What walked around wearing his face was something else entirely. The trial itself was theater for the masses. Over 500 people crammed into Westminster Hall to watch. William Howard was carried in on a stretcher. He couldn't sit upright anymore. They propped him against a wooden frame so the judges could see his face. The charges were read aloud. All the confessions obtained under torture were entered into evidence. Names William had provided while being burned with hot irons. Details he'd invented while his fingers were being crushed. Conspiracies he'd described while hanging from his dislocated shoulders. None of it was real. Everyone in that courtroom knew none of it was real. That wasn't the point. The prosecution called Thomas Howard as their star witness. He walked to the front of the hall with the same composed expression he'd worn throughout this nightmare. He placed his hand on a Bible and swore to tell the truth. For the next hour, Thomas Howard testified against his son. He confirmed every detail of every confession. He added observations of his own. Conversations he'd supposedly had with William about betraying the king. Meetings he'd supposedly witnessed between William and Lancastrian sympathizers. All of it fiction. All of it necessary. The judges asked Thomas Howard directly, "Do you believe your son is guilty of high treason against King Edward IV?" The courtroom went silent. This was the moment everyone came to see. The father's final judgment of his son. Thomas Howard looked at William for the first time since entering the court. His son's eyes held no accusation, no anger, just exhaustion, and something that might have been pity. "Yes, Your Honors, I believe him guilty. More than that, I know him guilty. I have seen the evidence with my own eyes, heard the confessions from his own lips. He is a traitor to the crown and deserves the full punishment prescribed by law." William closed his eyes. A single tear ran down his ruined face. "Furthermore," Thomas Howard continued, and his voice didn't waver, "I recommend he be executed by drawing and quartering. Let his death serve as warning to others who would betray their king." Drawing and quartering was the most brutal execution method available in medieval England. The condemned would be dragged through the streets tied to a horse, hanged until nearly dead, then cut down while still conscious, disemboweled while alive, castrated, cut into quarters while still aware. The pieces distributed to different cities for public display. Thomas Howard had just recommended this fate for his own son. The judges conferred briefly. The verdict was announced within minutes. Guilty on all charges, sentenced to be drawn and quartered at Tyburn in 3 days' time. As William was carried from the courtroom, he turned his head one final time toward his father. He mouthed 2 words. No sound came out, but Thomas Howard could read his son's lips clearly. "Thank you." The execution was scheduled for dawn, but the real horror would come in the hours between the sentence and the scaffold. Because that night, Thomas Howard would do something that proved even he had limits to what he could perform for political survival. And what happened in those dark hours would transform this entire grotesque theater into something even more devastating than anyone had anticipated. The night between William Howard's sentencing and his scheduled execution, Thomas Howard dismissed all his servants. He locked himself in his private chambers. What happened in those rooms over the next 12 hours would only be discovered later through testimonies of servants who listened at doors and guards who patrolled outside. Around midnight, the screaming started. Not the controlled, careful sounds of a man maintaining composure. Animal sounds, raw and broken. Thomas Howard was howling like something wounded beyond healing. Servants heard furniture being smashed, glass breaking, objects thrown against walls with enough force to crack stone. Margaret, the head housekeeper who'd served the Howard family for 23 years, dared to knock on the door around 2 in the morning. The sounds coming from inside had shifted from rage to something worse, sobbing that went on so long it didn't seem physiologically possible. "My lord, should I send for a physician?" The sobbing stopped abruptly. Thomas Howard's voice came through the door, and Margaret would later say it sounded like someone else entirely. Not the Earl of Essex. Something that had been hollowed out and filled with broken glass. "Get away from this door. If you approach again, I'll have you hanged alongside my son." Margaret retreated. The sounds continued through the night. More breaking, more screaming. Around 4 in the morning, the sounds of violent vomiting. Then silence that somehow seemed worse than the noise. What the servants didn't know was that Thomas Howard had spent those hours doing something that would have gotten him executed if discovered. He'd been writing letters, dozens of them, each one a desperate attempt to undo what couldn't be undone. Letters to the king begging for clemency, letters to nobles calling in every favor he was owed, letters to the families orchestrating the false charges, offering to surrender his entire estate, letters to the Archbishop of Canterbury pleading for ecclesiastical intervention, letters to foreign ambassadors asking them to request royal mercy as diplomatic courtesy, each letter more desperate than the last, each one revealing information that could be used against him, admitting he'd lied in his testimony, confessing his son was innocent, acknowledging the charges were manufactured. Every word was evidence of his own treason. He sealed each letter and addressed it, set them in a pile on his desk. Then, one by one, he threw them into his fireplace and watched them burn. Because sending even one would have been suicide. Not just for him, but for his entire remaining family. The system that was killing William would gladly kill everyone else too if given excuse. Around dawn, servants heard different sounds from the Earl's chambers. Furniture being moved, drawers opening and closing, the metallic sounds of weapons being handled. Several servants became convinced Thomas Howard was planning to kill himself. One brave soul ran to fetch Sir Robert Ashford. Ashford arrived just as the sun was rising. He found Thomas Howard's door unlocked. The Earl sat at his desk, fully dressed in fresh clothing. His face was clean, hair combed, hands steady. The room behind him looked like a battle had occurred. Broken furniture, shattered mirrors, torn tapestries. But Thomas Howard himself appeared completely composed. On the desk in front of him lay a loaded crossbow, a dagger, a vial of what Ashford immediately recognized as poison. Weapons of suicide laid out like surgical instruments. "I spent 3 hours deciding which method would be fastest," Thomas Howard said conversationally. "The crossbow seemed most certain, but there's risk of merely wounding myself. The poison is reliable but takes time. The dagger offers control but requires commitment." "Thomas, I picked them all up, held them, considered the mechanics. Do you know what stopped me? Not love for my other children, not duty to my wife, not fear of damnation." Ashford waited. "What stopped me was knowing that if I'm dead, there's no one to witness William's execution. He'll die alone, surrounded by strangers who think he's a traitor. At least if I'm there, one person in that crowd will know the truth. One person will see him die knowing he was innocent. You can't go to the execution, Thomas. You'll break completely. Everyone will see." Thomas Howard stood. His hands didn't shake anymore. His face held the same composed mask he'd worn throughout this nightmare. But his eyes had changed. Something fundamental had died in them during the night. I won't break. I've already broken. What's left is just performance, and I'm going to perform perfectly one final time for William, because it's the only thing I can give him now. The execution was scheduled for 8 in the morning at Tyburn. Thomas Howard arrived early. He positioned himself in the front of the crowd in clear view of the scaffold, the same position he'd occupied during the courtyard torture, where William would be able to see him during his final moments. The crowd gathered. Over 1,000 people. Executions were public entertainment in medieval London. Drawing and quartering executions drew the largest crowds because they lasted longest and provided the most dramatic spectacle. At exactly 8 o'clock, they brought William Howard out. He was tied to a wooden hurdle that would be dragged through the streets behind a horse. The journey from Tower to Tyburn was 2 miles. The route had been chosen to pass through the most populated areas. Maximum public humiliation before death. William's body was so damaged from torture that he couldn't maintain any position on his own. They'd tied him to the hurdle so tightly he couldn't move even if his destroyed joints had allowed it. His face was barely recognizable. Swollen, bruised, missing teeth, eyes that didn't quite focus anymore. The horse began pulling the hurdle through the streets. Cobblestones tore at William's back. People threw refuse, rotted vegetables, rocks, human waste. The crowd shouted insults at the traitor being dragged to his death. Thomas Howard walked alongside the hurdle, close enough that William could see him, close enough that their eyes met multiple times during that 2-mile journey. The Earl maintained his composed expression, the slight smile that had become his trademark during this entire ordeal. But his hands were shaking again, trembling so violently that several people in the crowd noticed. Some whispered that the Earl was excited by his son's approaching death. Others thought he might be cold despite the warm morning. No one guessed the truth. At Tyburn, the executioner was already waiting. The gallows stood ready. The wooden platform where the butchery would occur had been freshly cleaned from the previous day's execution. Everything was prepared for the show. They hauled William onto the platform, positioned him for the first stage, the hanging that would bring him close to death without killing him. The executioner was skilled. This part required precision. Too much hanging, and the condemned died too quickly. Too little, and they'd be too conscious for the later stages. Thomas Howard stood directly in front of the scaffold, in the front row of witnesses, where William could see him clearly for these final moments. As they placed the noose around William's neck, the young man spoke. His voice was barely audible. Damaged vocal cords and broken jaw made words difficult, but people in the front rows heard him clearly. "Father, I forgive you. I understand. Take care of Mother and the others." Thomas Howard's mask cracked. Just for a moment. His face contorted in anguish so profound that several witnesses would later say they'd never seen such an expression on a human face before. His mouth opened. He tried to speak. No sound came out. Then something happened that no one expected. Thomas Howard lunged toward the scaffold. He tried to reach his son. Guards immediately grabbed him, holding him back. He struggled against them with strength that surprised everyone. "William, I'm sorry, you're innocent. Everyone, he's innocent. The charges were false. I lied. I tortured my own innocent son." The crowd went silent. Guards wrestled Thomas Howard backward, but he kept shouting. Every word was his own death sentence. Every phrase was confession of treason and perjury. The letters were forged. The witnesses were paid. My son never betrayed anyone. I killed him to save myself. I'm the traitor. Me, not him. Sir Geoffrey Mallory, present as always to observe and record, signaled to nearby soldiers. More guards rushed forward to restrain Thomas Howard. They gagged him to stop the confessions, dragged him away from the scaffold as he thrashed and fought. On the platform, William Howard watched his father's breakdown with an expression that witnesses would argue about for years afterward. Some said he looked triumphant. Others said peaceful. A few claimed he was smiling, Not in joy, but in relief. As if this public breakdown was exactly what he'd been waiting for through all the torture and betrayal. At the execution, as his son's head was placed on the block, the father's mask would finally crack. But not in the way anyone expected. Because what happened next would reveal that even in medieval England's machinery of systematic cruelty, there were still moments when human nature refused to be completely crushed. They dragged Thomas Howard to a holding cell beneath Westminster Palace, while William's execution continued. The Earl was now a prisoner himself. His public confession of perjury and false testimony made him a criminal by his own admission. But they couldn't process his arrest until after William's execution was complete. The show had to go on. William Howard was hanged for exactly 90 seconds, long enough to lose consciousness, short enough to revive. When they cut him down, he was still breathing, still aware. The executioner's assistant threw water in his face to ensure he was conscious for what came next. The disembowelment happened while William was still alive. This was the point of drawing and quartering. Maximum suffering, maximum spectacle. The executioner opened William's abdomen with practiced precision, pulled out his intestines while he watched. The pain was beyond anything torture had inflicted, beyond what human consciousness should be able to process. But William Howard didn't scream. His damaged vocal cords wouldn't allow it anyway, but witnesses said his face showed something other than agony, something that looked almost like peace, as if he'd already left his body behind, and what remained was just meat going through final motions. The castration came next, then the quartering. By the time they began cutting his body into pieces, William Howard was dead, mercifully faster than most drawing and quartering victims. The prior torture had weakened him too much to survive the full process. His head was placed on a pike at London Bridge. His body quarters were sent to 4 different cities for public display: York, Bristol, Canterbury, Dover, warning to anyone who might consider treason. Except William Howard had never committed treason. He'd been murdered by a legal system that didn't care about guilt or innocence. Meanwhile, Thomas Howard sat in his cell and waited. The breakdown at the execution meant his fate was now uncertain. He'd publicly confessed to lying under oath, to torturing his son under false pretenses, to participating in a conspiracy to execute an innocent man. Sir Geoffrey Mallory came to interview him 3 hours after the execution. Mallory's job was to determine whether the Earl's outburst was genuine confession or temporary madness brought on by witnessing his son's death. "Tell me exactly what you meant by your statements at Tyburn." Thomas Howard had regained his composure. The mask was back in place, but it was different now, thinner, more transparent, as if he no longer cared whether people could see through it. "I meant exactly what I said. My son was innocent. The charges were manufactured. I participated in his torture and execution to save my own position and protect my other children. I am guilty of everything William was accused of. Except William actually did it." Mallory studied him carefully. "You understand this is confession of high treason?" "Yes." "You understand you'll be executed?" "Yes." "And your remaining children will suffer under corruption of blood?" Thomas Howard's mask finally shattered completely. Tears ran down his face, his voice broke, but he kept speaking. "My remaining children have already suffered corruption of blood, just not the legal kind. They've learned that fathers betray sons to save themselves. That family means nothing compared to political survival. That love is a weakness to be exploited by stronger powers. I've corrupted their blood more thoroughly than any treason conviction could. At least this way they'll know I finally chose truth over survival." Mallory left to consult with the Privy Council. The council faced an unusual problem. Executing Thomas Howard would prove his confession was true, which meant William Howard had been innocent, which meant the king had executed an innocent man based on manufactured evidence, which would raise questions about how many other treason convictions were similarly false. They debated for 2 days, finally reached a decision that perfectly illustrated medieval political logic. Thomas Howard would not be charged with treason. Instead, he would be charged with madness brought on by grief. Temporary insanity that caused him to make false statements at his son's execution. He would be found guilty of disturbing the king's peace and sentenced to house arrest for life. His property would be confiscated to pay fines. His remaining children would lose their inheritance. But they wouldn't face corruption of blood. The family name would survive, though in disgrace. And most importantly, William Howard's conviction would stand. The official record would show him as a traitor, his father as a grief-maddened fool. Everything else would be forgotten. Thomas Howard was released to house arrest at his smallest, least valuable property. A manor in Cornwall, far from London, far from anyone who mattered. He lived there for 3 more years in complete isolation. Servants who attended him during this period said he never spoke William's name aloud. But he had developed a habit of sitting at his window for hours, staring north toward London, toward where William's head still rotted on its pike at London Bridge. In 1474, Thomas Howard died in his sleep. Natural causes, according to the physician who examined him. But the servants who found his body noticed something strange. He died with his right hand extended toward the north-facing window, as if reaching for something far away. The truly grotesque revelation came months after Thomas Howard's death. A servant cleaning out his Cornwall manor found hidden papers, letters Thomas had written but never sent during his house arrest. Over 200 pages. A complete confession of everything. Names of the nobles who'd orchestrated the false charges against William. Details of the properties they'd wanted. Evidence of prior similar conspiracies that had resulted in other false treason convictions. The servant brought the letters to ecclesiastical authorities, hoping for justice. The letters were immediately confiscated and burned. No investigation was launched. No charges were filed, because the truth was far more dangerous than the lie. But before the letters were destroyed, a monk named Brother Edmund made copies. He hid them in a monastery archive where they remained forgotten for 2 centuries. When historians finally discovered them in the 1600s, they revealed something horrifying. William Howard's case wasn't unique. Between 1461 and 1483, over 40 similar cases occurred. Nobles executed for treason based on manufactured evidence, property seized by families who'd arranged the false charges, parents testifying against children, siblings betraying each other, all following the same pattern, all ending the same way. Medieval England had industrialized family betrayal, turned it into a systematic mechanism for wealth transfer and political control. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. The autopsy records of William Howard, preserved in Tower archives, revealed final details. His body had been so damaged by torture that the executioner noted unusual difficulties during the quartering. Several internal organs were already necrotized from prior torture. His skeletal structure showed evidence of deliberate, systematic destruction. The medical examiner estimated he'd experienced approximately 40 hours of torture total across multiple sessions. 40 hours of his father watching. 40 hours of his father participating. 40 hours of his father maintaining that grotesque smile of political survival. Thomas Howard's autopsy was simpler. The physician found an enlarged heart, severely damaged liver, evidence of chronic stress that had literally destroyed his organs from inside. But the detail that caught attention was his hands. Even in death, they were clenched into fists so tight that they had to break his fingers to straighten them for burial. Medieval justice didn't care about guilt or innocence. It cared about examples and control. A father's smile while watching his son's torture wasn't cruelty. It was the system working exactly as designed, crushing human bonds under the weight of absolute power, turning family love into a weapon against itself. Both father and son became nothing more than rotting reminders that in the medieval world, love itself was a liability that could get you killed. And the cruelest torture wasn't physical. It was the knowledge that everyone involved knew the truth, and that truth meant absolutely nothing compared to the demands of power. The Howard family line continued through Thomas's remaining children. They regained much of their wealth and status over the following generation. built successful careers, married well, had children of their own. But family records show that none of Thomas Howard's descendants ever named a son William again. For 3 centuries that name was forbidden in the family, an unspoken acknowledgement that some betrayals leave scars that outlast the people who inflicted them. And on foggy nights in London, locals reported seeing a figure standing at London Bridge, staring up at the pikes where traitors' heads rotted. The figure would stand there for hours in the rain, never moving, never speaking, just watching. When approached, the figure would vanish. But people swore it looked like Thomas Howard, Earl of Essex, still maintaining his vigil, still reaching for the son he'd destroyed with his own hands, still wearing that mask of composed survival even in death. Because in medieval England, some performances didn't end with execution. They echoed through centuries, reminding everyone who came after that there are fates worse than death. And sometimes the greatest torture isn't what's done to your body. It's what you're forced to do to someone you love while the world watches and applauds your loyalty.